Well, folks, it's good to see everybody here. I know there'll be people joining us as we go along, but let's get ahead with our program. I'm very happy that you could join us for an unusual, but I hope meaningful way to wrap up the academic year of activities at the Wiedenbaum Center. Although that said, we have another event scheduled for early June or mid-June, actually, where we'll be talking about the first 100 days of the Biden administration. But this event today is particularly our donor appreciation event, and you can tell it's a special day because I am wearing a tie. And for those of you who are long-term Wiedenbaum Center people, you know that this is something I generally won't do, but there are a few exceptions. I'm looking over at my friend Stuart Greenbaum from the business school and seeing that, Stuart, you're looking just like I'd like to with your t-shirt over there. And so we know that we're in a special day today when Fazari's got a tie on. These events.
Thank you.
These events are a moment to take stock of a year's worth of activities. About this time last year, I didn't quite know what we would be able to do, but I'm happy to say that, at least by my count, we're approaching about the 20th event for the Wiedenbaum Center since the middle of last summer. I think that's really quite nice. Our attendance has always been in the neighborhood of 50. Sometimes we've gotten over 150. So we've been able to talk to a lot of people a number of times over the course of an interesting year. It's also the case that most of our audience is from St. Louis, but we have learned to use the remote technology to connect with interested people from around the country. And we're going to try to continue doing that in the future. And so I'm really very pleased to recognize how we've managed to stay connected in what has been a really challenging year. I want to just take a few minutes before we start the formal part of our program, and I welcome Professor Gibson to just to share a few thoughts about the center and what the year has been, and offer a few thanks. In particular, this is a time for thanks. As I said, a year ago, I had just agreed to direct the center after almost 20 years of creative and very impactful leadership from the other Steve, that is, of course, Steve Smith. I've been associate director for well over a decade, but it was a big change for me to step into the top job, and I needed all the help I could get. Fortunately, I got a lot of it. And I just want to recognize the other people that directly associated with the center now, our staff in the broad sense. And I'll start with Professor Guillermo Rosas. Guillermo is now my partner in faculty leadership as associate director of the center. Guillermo is an outstanding scholar in comparative politics, expert in political institutions and social conditions in Latin America. Guillermo and I have had a lot of deep and sometimes very lengthy conversations about the direction of the center and the structure of our programs. And I have to say, this has been enormously helpful. We've known each other for many years, but we've become close colleagues and good friends over the past months. And all of this without ever meeting in person, as it turns out, which actually is going to change tomorrow, interestingly. But Guillermo, could you just say hi to the audience here?
Thank you, Steve, of course, and thank you very much for those very kind words. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you.
Thanks, Guillermo. And next, I want to turn to Alana Bame. Alana has done a huge amount of work over the past year. She's had a huge amount of stuff on her plate. It has been stressful at times, but she always steps up to make sure our activities stay on track. Our faculty are very well supported. I very much appreciate Alana's dedication, loyalty, and always commitment to doing a great job. Thanks very much again, Alana, and please greet the crowd so they can see you.
I'm here.
Thanks, Alana. Next, I'm actually happy to introduce our newest staff member, Elizabeth Larson. Elizabeth has just joined the Wiedenbaum Center, in fact, I think just 2.5 weeks ago, as Associate Director for Research and Administration. Elizabeth has a background in law and journalism with a very strong interest in social issues. I just learned that she studied abroad in South Africa. She's got a great background and experience. She's off to a terrific start. We've been talking regularly. And you, as the Wiedenbaum Center group here, will be seeing a lot of Elizabeth in the coming academic year and beyond. So, Elizabeth, why don't you say hello, and we welcome you to the Wiedenbaum Center.
Thank you, Steve. And it was those are very nice words for you to say, and probably a little undeserved at only 10 days in, but I really appreciate them, and I'm looking forward to meeting all of you. So, thank you.
Great. It's really good to have Elizabeth here. And so, what's my final staff thank you? It is bittersweet. I have worked with Melinda Warren for 39 of her 40 years as a member of the center staff. It's really kind of hard to believe in that sense that it's been that long. We've been friends for decades, but I never fully appreciated Melinda's enormous contributions until this past year. She has been a thoughtful and dedicated partner for me, and I know for Steve Smith before me, in managing the center. Melinda has also helped keep me on track when I've gotten a bit off the rails. I basically think of Melinda's with the quote, "Don't worry, it will be fine." And she is always right about that. And so it has been right through this difficult year. As we just heard from Alana, Melinda will start a well-deserved retirement from the center and Washington University on July 1st. We will miss you very much. I'm looking over at you on the screen right now. As Melinda does, all of us will, but I'm sure all of you will join me in wishing Melinda the best in this next exciting time in her life. So now would normally be the time, if we were in the Knight Center, for us all to get up and have a raucous standing ovation for Melinda as a thank you for everything she's done over the year and good wishes for the future. So we'll do whatever we can virtually. Melinda, join us here to just say hello and let everybody see you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for working with me for all these years. I really appreciate everybody's help on Elliott Society issues and getting to know everyone, and look forward to seeing you in the future.
That's right. She won't be a stranger. We're going to make sure of that. So my thanks have to go now to you, to the people here on the Zoom call, and your contributions that make our programs possible. I want to specifically recognize the leaders of our Elliott Society, and I won't embarrass them by making them come on the screen. But of course, this starts with Jim Shealy, our longtime chair of the Elliott Society Committee. I've worked with Jim for many years since I became associated with the center, but our relationship has deepened as I've stepped into the director's role in this past year. And I must say, Jim's dedication to the Wiedenbaum Center is absolutely amazing. Through his leadership, the center has raised funds that support an extensive program of research and public outreach. He's a trusted advisor and a good friend. He always has been, and we've again become closer over the past year. So thanks very much to Jim. I'm also pleased to announce that Molly Klein and Steve Knight will be joining Jim as vice chairs of the Elliott Society for the Wiedenbaum Center in the coming year. Molly's been an active member of our Elliott Society Committee for years. She provides really great support and advice and very terrific program suggestions. I was thinking today that the doctor from the medical school spoke to us about the COVID vaccines. That was specifically Molly's recommendation. I know she's had that, had very good ideas about our programs going forward, and we look forward to more of them in the future. So thanks to Molly. Steve Knight clearly has the right first name to play a major role in the leadership of the Wiedenbaum Center. As most of you know, Steve is the son of our late friend Jim Knight. Is just a personal reflection. When I first became associate director of the center, Jim was one of the first people to invite me out to lunch and welcome me, and I always enjoyed my relationship with Steve's father, and it's really rewarding to see center participation passing through these generations. Steve and I have had several good talks, some pretty detailed talks about the center and its direction, and I'm very much looking forward to working with him as we go forward. So to channel a little bit of Jim Shealy and the rest of the committee members, as you know, we are coming up on the end of our fiscal year, which is June 30th, and we still are somewhat short of our annual membership goal. So if you haven't renewed your membership for the coming academic year, we would very much appreciate the continuation of your generosity going forward, and a renewal in the next couple of weeks. So keep an eye out about that. Mary Maher is here on the call, and I know Mary would be happy to help anybody that is looking to re-up at the Wiedenbaum Center. Before we turn to Professor Gibson's talk, I do want to talk a little bit about research at the center. As you know, in addition to public outreach, a major part of our mission is to support impactful research of our faculties in economics, political science, and sociology. And let me give you a bit of an update, and I think it's going to be interesting for you. So a big part of what the center does is provide direct funding for research projects from our own revenues. And this year, we committed to $861,000 of research support, which is a very significant number. And it makes a huge difference to what our faculty can accomplish. As I've said to you at other times, this matters for careers. About half of that, just short of $1 million of support, has gone to junior faculty who are just starting their careers. These are the future of Washington University social sciences. And we are very, very glad to be able to support their careers in this way. This makes a difference for Washington University. When our faculty are productive, when their work is prominent, this raises the stature of the university in the country and across the world. And it makes a difference for our societies. The work that we support addresses critical social issues. The evidence and insights that this research develops, as you're going to be hearing about today, help to make the world a better place. It's really very rewarding to be part of this effort in this case to be able to support this kind of research. In addition, and very importantly, and to some extent a bit surprisingly to me in the last year since I've taken over leadership at the center, is the role the center plays in external grant administration. So as you know, faculty are active in seeking external funding for their research from National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health, different kinds of private foundations. And the center is central to supporting these efforts. Again, I have to have a shout out to Alana, who's worked extremely hard in helping our faculty develop, submit, edit grant proposals, which can be quite detailed, and also supporting the administration of the grants after they come in and how the funds are spent. We had actually 25 separate faculty grant proposals to external agencies submitted over the past academic year. We don't know the full outcomes yet from these proposals, but we do know that just in the last year, $875,000 of research funding has been awarded from the outside. So when you put together our internal support, plus the external support that we are helping to procure, we're approaching $2 million of research support directly or indirectly coming from or with the assistance of the center. And there are really two sources, for this, both for our internal funds primarily, but also for the staffing that helps support faculty external research awards. One is the legacy of Murray Wiedenbaum. Murray's vision and creativity led to the creation of a substantial endowment for the center, and the income from that endowment provides a lot of the revenue that we use for our activities, both our programs as well as the research support. But of course, it's also the generosity of you, of our supporters, who helps us do what we're able to do. And what we have been able to do so far, in my humble opinion, is outstanding and very impactful, but we'd like to do more. We are ramping up our support for external grant activities. In fact, we have a new staff member starting Monday, with a major part of her job will be to help with our external grant activities and hopefully take some of the burden off of Alana. But also the generosity of our internal funding is critical. And to be honest, we're about the limit of what we can afford. That number of just below $900,000, given our revenue sources right now, that's about what we can do. And we're able to do it, and it's great. But we'd like to do more, and there your generosity will help us. So in these events over the years, you've heard about the kind of research the center has funded. You've heard us talk about immigration policy. You've heard us talk about peacekeeping in Africa. You've heard about challenges faced by mothers and families in the COVID-19 pandemic. You've heard about the economic impact of U.S. government debt. You've heard about clean water policy and families and how that affects families in India. And among many other things, you've heard about what drives perceptions about the legitimacy of key institutions supporting American democracy, and we're about to turn to that now. But the research on all these topics, and as I say, many, many more, was supported by the Wiedenbaum Center through your generosity. And I have to again say, thank you very much. So that's it from me. I'm now happy to introduce our keynote speaker for this afternoon. James Gibson. Jim is the Sidney Souers Professor of Government in our Department of Political Science. He's been on our faculty for over 20 years. Jim has a very distinguished career with prolific research on law and courts, economic justice, race relations, various international issues. He has his connection to South Africa as well as Cambodia, I believe. But much of Jim's work centers on the US. And it's been a pleasure over the years, especially this last year, to work with Jim to help support this work. And in the past few months, he has been studying how Americans perceive key institutions in their federal government. And a lot of this work had to happen quickly as events unfolded so rapidly following the November election. And I'm very pleased that the Wiedenbaum Center's research support could respond fast and help Jim learn a lot about how the past few months did, and in fact did not, change Americans' view of their government. So I'm very pleased, and we're all very fortunate to have Jim with us this afternoon. His talk is entitled After the Storm, Racial Differences in Veneration for America's Democracy. Jim, we're looking forward to hear about what you have to teach us on this very important topic, and I pass the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, Steve. Let me share my screen. So, Steve, thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm very pleased to be here to talk to you about some of my recent research that the Wiedenbaum Center has supported. and to celebrate, of course, the end of the semester, and perhaps even to celebrate what I hope is the last damn Zoom presentation that I have to give in my entire life. I'm not a great fan of Zoom. I can't see who's drinking wine and who isn't. I can't see who's falling asleep and who isn't. So I hope indeed this is the last one that I have to do. The topic I want to talk about today is the health and future of American democracy. I'm hoping that that's a topic that is of some interest to everybody on this call, and really irrespective of our ideological or academic backgrounds. I think the issue of where America is going is one that cuts across a lot of different kinds of interest. With this talk, I'm repaying some of the debt, a small part of the debt I owe to the Wiedenbaum Center. Over the years, I've been the beneficiary of a great deal of support from the Wiedenbaum Center across both Steves, and it's just made a gigantic difference in the contributions that I've been able to make to social sciences. The Wiedenbaum Center really is one of the key assets of Washington University. It's one of the institutions that helps so many people here and makes the social sciences so much stronger than it would be without the Wiedenbaum Center. So the first thing I want to say to all of y'all today is thank you very much for the support that you've given me and my colleagues for our research. Okay, I'll turn to the topic for today, and I thought it might be a little bit useful to tell you something about my background on this subject, and that is the ways in which democracies develop and the ways in which they fail. Throughout all of my career, I've been working on processes of democratization. My team was the second team to go into the Soviet Union and do surveys of public opinion beginning in 1989. And with support from the National Science Foundation, we were able to continue that research for well over a decade. I've done work throughout the European Union on all sorts of issues of democratization. And then in the last several decades, I've been heavily involved in studies of South Africa's process of democratization. And in particular, I've written 3 books that have come to be known as the Overcoming Trilogy that deal with different problems that South Africa has had to overcome in its pathway to democracy. Having spent about 3 decades in Africa, I've come to love it, actually a great deal. I've also become an expert on safaris in South Africa. So I thought one proposal might be to simply blow off democracy and talk about safaris for the next 40 minutes. I guess if Steve weren't here, I would far rather give you a presentation on the animals of Africa than the people of America. But Steve is here. And so I'll tell you, I'll focus on my project on American democratization. Now, the theory that's important here is a theory of political culture. And it asserts that the functioning of institutions is fundamentally dependent upon the beliefs, the values, the attitudes, and the behaviors of ordinary people. Learned Hand was a distinguished jurist, and I think he said it very, very well. He said, democracy lies in the hearts of men and women. When it dies there, no constitution, no law, no court can save it. No constitution, no law, no court can even do much to help it. What Hand is arguing here is that institutions need the support of their constituents in order to be effective. If democratic institutions lose the confidence of their constituents, they lose their stability and they become threatened. In my work in the Soviet Union, we relied very heavily on this theory. Sovietologists argued that democracy could never succeed in Russia. And they argued that because of 1,000 years of authoritarian cultures in the Soviet Union. Now, I think we showed that they were wrong, at least for a particular kind of democracy, but many people point to cultural factors as the key elements in whether democracy is going to succeed. One of our best scholars is Larry Diamond at Stanford. And Larry has a very famous quote that goes as follows: political competitors must come to regard democracy and the laws, procedures, and institutions it specifies as the only game in town, the only viable framework for governing the society and advancing their own interest. So what he's saying there is that without ordinary people believing that democracy, there's no alternative to democracy, then democracy will be weakened and unable to survive through crises. He goes on to say, at the mass level, there must be a broad normative and behavioral consensus, one that cuts across class, ethnicity, nationality, and other cleavages on the legitimacy of the constitutional system, however poor or unsatisfying its performance may be at any given point in time. Again, he's pointing to this concept of democratic legitimacy. Without legitimacy, institutions have to succeed all the time. No institution can succeed all the time. I always say legitimacy is for losers. And what I mean by that is legitimacy is necessary to stand by institutions once they're under stress. Now, the general question that I asked about in Russia and South Africa and the EU and elsewhere is how does democracy get established? Are the cultural requisites in place for democracy to succeed? Now, just as an aside, there's been, and you may not actually realize this, but there's been an enormous change in Washington U social sciences over the last 22 years. When I first came here, this was a university very heavily committed to institutional analysis with practically no consideration of culture or public opinion. And boy, that has really changed. Today, we see at least equal and maybe even a predominant interest in cultural factors and in how institutions perform and whether they succeed or not. I also note a second irony. One of my first books was on democracy in America. It was a book about the efforts of Nazis to hold a demonstration in Skokie, Illinois in the 1970s. After that book, I left the US and have worked all around the world, but it's interesting to me to note that I've come back to the United States with this very same question of whether the culture is sufficient to sustain democratic institutions. Now, you probably know this is a worldwide issue. Everybody is concerned about the way in which cultures erode and corrode, and therefore how democracies fail. We have an interesting finding from one of our earlier studies in the EU that has only become relevant to me in recent times. And that is, in older democracies, support for freedom of speech among ordinary people was lower than in new democracies. In new democracies, freedom of speech was valued more. Now, that's sort of interesting. I think it may be a function of the fact that over time, people learned that democracy is messy. Democracy involves compromise. Democracy involves putting up with people that we don't like, that we don't care about. Over time, people learn that there are costs to free speech, and therefore they value it less. I don't think there's a better example of that in the world than the current debates within universities on the value of freedom of speech. And perhaps I'll be able to talk to you a little bit about that in the fall sometime. So it's causing people to wonder whether the American people believe the benefits of democracy exceed the cost. And I think that's a very important issue. We call it democratic backsliding. And, you know, some people say it's a breakdown of democracy, Poland, Hungary, elsewhere. But I believe that it's better understood as a breakdown of liberalism in the context of liberal democracy. Liberalism in the traditional definition of liberalism, not the political one. There are lots of alternatives to democracy out there that people are advocating. Militant democracy is one, the German version, for instance. Illiberal democracies have sprung up all over the world. They predominate in Africa, in my continent. And there's lots of rejection of democracy that is developing in many places in the world. So I don't think it's at all clear that Larry Diamond's only game in town still pertains today. I think there are multiple games in town, and that we have to investigate the willingness of people to stand by a democracy. So with that kind of preface, it takes me to the election of 2020 and the insurrection on July 6th, 2021 in Washington, D.C. You might remember this picture. You might remember the next one, where the mob is ransacking the Capitol building. I recognize that there's some debate about this issue, but I consider this an insurrection. And to double check that, I looked at the definition of insurrection in Merriam-Webster, and it seems that their definition is a pretty good description of what happened on January 6th of this year. So the question is that an isolated event that really has no consequences? Or is that an event that eroded support for democratic values in the United States and is a harbinger of a democratic crisis in the near future? Is this an example of democratic backsliding in the United States? Now, I've written a fair amount about that already, but today I want to talk to you about African Americans. You might remember the Diamond quote that I mentioned a minute ago. It said, all segments of society must participate, must embrace the democratic culture of a society. Now, I think that there's some reasons to believe that we're at a watershed moment in American politics on race. Obviously, we have George Floyd, we have heightened racial consciousness. Many of the events of the insurrection had a decided racial element to them. You probably remember this picture of the Confederate flag of one of the insurrectionists inside the Capitol building. So I think it's important to know how these events affect everybody. I definitely agree to that. But I also think it's important to know how it affects African Americans, how it affects Hispanics, and how it affects other racial and ethnic minorities in the US. We do know a little bit about this. I published a book in 2018 that I'll talk a little bit more about later. But generally speaking, our knowledge of public opinion in this country is knowledge of white public opinion. Now, I thought about digressing for a moment here and taking y'all through a discussion of the methodology and statistics of survey research. And then I thought maybe that's not the world's greatest idea, so I'm not going to do that. But I do want to tell you that it's awfully hard and expensive to study minority groups in the United States. Think about a representative sample of 1,000 people. Well, at best, that's going to realize 120 African Americans, maybe 150 Hispanics. And that's a very small sample from which to draw any meaningful conclusions. But more than that, the samples that we get that way are deficient in many respects. And the number one is, of course, young Black men. They're always underrepresented in surveys that don't make specific efforts to include them. And this is expensive. So we haven't reached the point, we pay hundreds and hundreds, even $1,000 for some interviews with elites, especially with physicians. We haven't reached that point yet, but minority respondents in surveys have become so valuable and so difficult to access that we do have to pay and do pay handsomely to include them in our surveys. It's a very expensive process. Now, that's of course where you come in. And maybe I don't have to say a whole lot more about that. I hope you get the hint that this work is expensive and can't be done without the generosity of people like you. Now, I think there are a lot of reasons to imagine why African Americans might not be so supportive of democratic institutions and processes. The first is, of course, experiences with legal authorities, both personal and vicarious. It turns out that my book, Black and Blue, but many other sources, have shown that about 40% of African Americans report having experienced an unfair encounter with police officers, 40%. We've got continuing racial inequality in this country. COVID might be an example, but many, many others, wealth, home ownership, et cetera. We've got heightened racial consciousness. Obviously, a prime component of that is the Black Lives Matter movement. I've got a proposal under consideration right now to examine how the Black Lives Movement has affected racial consciousness. The whole election, everything about it was racialized and continues to be through issues of voter suppression that have disproportionate impact on minority communities. And then there is My Black and Blue, in which from a 2014 survey, we showed that Black Americans are, even in 2014, were considerably less supportive of democratic institutions and processes than white people. So I'm going to report to you some evidence on Black support for democratic values today, and it's based on a survey that the Weinbaum Center and others supported, and it is a survey in February and March of 2021, so just a few months ago. Now, there's certainly gigantic racial differences in how people view the election. We queried people about 5 different events: the nomination of Coney Barrett to the US Supreme Court, allegations that the election was rigged or somehow manipulated, so it didn't represent the actual votes of the American people, Trump's effort to get the election overturned and reversed. These are all questions we've asked about in the survey. The insurrection on January 6th, in which the Capitol was ransacked, and the impeachment of President Trump and his acquittal before the Senate in February of 2021. This survey went into the field a week after Trump's acquittal. Let me give you a couple of examples of racial differences. So this is the question of whether the election was rigged. And you can see that very few Black Americans, 12%, say it was rigged, but 38% of white Americans believe it was rigged. Incidentally, this is a finding that even the surveys today, 2 months after mine, are reporting is about 35 to 40% of the American people think that the election was rigged. With regard to the insurrection, this question asked whether the insurrection was or was not harmful to American democracy. Practically no Black people say it was not harmful, but nearly 1/4 of whites say it was not harmful. So one of the first findings of the survey is that there are large racial differences in assessments of these events. And that pertains to all 5 of them. I just gave you a couple of examples. Now, the key question of this research is whether these assessments are connected to how people feel about democracy. You've heard a lot of people, pundits, say that things like the rioting on January 6th caused American people to lose confidence in democracy and in democratic institutions. So that is the precise purpose of the research that I'm reporting to you today. Now, I use in that research responses to 3 questions. These are agree, disagree questions. The way things are going right now, I have lost faith in American democratic institutions. With all the many fundamental flaws, American political institutions are not worth saving. And because American democracy is simply not working, we should scrap everything and start over in creating a new set of American political institutions. I see that not everyone likes these questions, but let me show you the results. On the question of lost faith in American institutions, only 31% have not lost faith. About 1/3 of people have not lost faith. With regard to whether they're worth saving, a majority, 61%, believe that the institutions are worth saving. And with regard to whether they should be scrapped and start over, about 2/3. So the way I sort of understand this is that people are beginning to lose faith in democracy, but it's still on probation, if you will. They haven't given up on democracy, but skepticism about whether democracy is the best system for this country is beginning to develop. So again, the conclusions I draw is there's a bedrock of support. Yes, there is a bedrock of support, but at the same time, it's far from consensual. Social scientists, when they use the word consensus, usually refer to about 75 to 80% agreement. And these figures are all below that. Now, the key question for today is racial differences. And here's what I found. This is a little index. It's simply the number of statements out of 3 that the respondents endorsed. And you can see from this slide that whites are the most supportive of democracy, endorsing 1.8 on average out of 3. Hispanics are the least, and African Americans are pretty low down there with Hispanics. Now, I don't put a whole lot of stock in the Hispanic figures. I'm working with an institute right now to try to do a proper Hispanic survey. They're very hard to do because of the many versions of Spanish that have to be used. But I don't put a whole lot of stock in those. I do put stock in the African Americans because that is interviews with almost 700 African Americans. So that's a quite reliable and a useful sample. So do these perceptions map on to these responses to democratic institutions? That's the question. Now, I'm going to be the first to acknowledge that my approach to this problem is less than ideal. And as I often do, I'm going to forgive myself for my shortcomings because this is what's called a firehouse kind of study. This is the kind of study like Skokie, like Nazis coming to Skokie. It's the kind of study in which we try to respond to events in the real world as they unfold, and we try to do the best we can with our methodology, even though that methodology may not be perfect. So I'm weak on questions of causality here. My main concerns is whether perceptions and evaluations of events map onto or connected to evaluations of democracy. And the answer is not always. Let me show you. So the conclusion there was a substantial racial differences. So the answer is not always. Here is an example of little or no relationship. What this graph shows is the connection between, or lack of connection between, approval of Trump not being convicted and support for democratic values, democratic institutions. And you can see here that there's just no relationship to speak of. Those who approve of Trump not being convicted differ very little from those who disapprove. So not all of these events are going to have had an impact on democracy. That's going to be a very important finding. Some have, however, they're racially specific. For Black people, there's some relationship between their assessments of the harm done to American democracy by the riots and support for democratic values. And that's a pretty good relationship. And for white people, it's not the riots. It's not the riots that are important. It's whether the election is rigged. White people who believe that the election was rigged are considerably less willing to support democratic institutions and processes. And that's a pretty good relationship. Now, the conclusion I draw is that the events of the 2020 election and its aftermath have been perhaps less consequential for democratic support than many have proclaimed. This is an unconventional finding. I think a lot of people simply assumed that things like the attack on the Capitol would undermine confidence. I find, again, some evidence. I'll put that in context in just a second. I find some evidence, but boy, not the widespread evidence that the election and how people assessed it really damaged their commitments to democratic values. Now, these early findings caused me to rethink a little bit. There is an alternative hypothesis here. And that hypothesis is that support for democratic institutions is not affected by ephemeral events of the day, but is much more strongly grounded in basic and fundamental commitments to the values of democracy. Done a lot of work on this, especially in the Soviet Union and South Africa. Values that are learned early, perhaps as early as 12 or 13 years old in school, values that change slowly over time, values that perhaps are more important in crises such as the one we've just come through than events. And a value that is of particular importance is not impeachment or anything like that, but rather is support for the rule of law. This is a little index based on 5 questions. And you can see the relationship here that shows that the more support for the rule of law, the more support for democratic institutions and processes. And what you may not have concluded yourself, so I'll tell you, is that this relationship is significantly stronger than any that I've shown you so far. There's a much closer connection between support for democratic institutions and these fundamental democratic values than there is on from perceptions and assessments of the events. So let me take a step away from the data. You know, any good data analysis will try to find the story that the data tell. It's data analysis is not just a collection of discrete facts. It's rather trying to understand the mechanisms and the processes that weave things together. So I'm going to take a step away from the data. I already told you this is a firehouse study that definitely has some methodological limitations. I'm going to take a step away from the data and try to tell you a story about what I think this project has found. The first thing is that this story is about a more fundamental alienation from democratic institutions and processes, and one that existed prior to anything that happened in 2020. Our study, Black and Blue, showed in 2014 that African Americans were substantially less supportive of democratic values such as rule of law, support for individual liberty, political tolerance, things like that. So there's an alienation from the underpinning of democracy has evolved in this country that's very, very important. And racial differences on that are quite substantial. On the basis of the theory of motivated reasoning, it seems to me that one interpretation of my findings is that these weak commitments to democratic institutions and processes structure how people perceive and assess political events. You may not know it, but motivated reasoning is one of the most important theories in all of the social sciences today. And what it basically means is that people filter information so as to be in agreement with the pre-existing beliefs that they hold. It's profoundly important. I don't ever do it, but I see my wife doing it all the time. It has a gigantic impact in how people interpret events, and it makes it very difficult for public opinion to change because people are seeing reality in a way that's in agreement with what they want to see. It's a very, very powerful theory, and therefore it's not at all surprising to me that this could explain what happened in the 2020 election. Indeed, an alternative theory is that my data suggests that the events reinforced but did not change pre-existing beliefs about American democracy. You know, one of the fundamental truisms about American public opinion is that it's very, very difficult to change. So I think what we may have seen is a reinforcement that contributes to greater polarization rather than a change in political values. So this makes me wonder about the need to rekindle fundamental commitments to democratic institutions and to remember what a perilous task that is, and to remember how it's even more perilous in the context of polarization. You might know that the American government spends about $500 million a year, $500 million a year, teaching democracy around the world, trying to create and reinforce these values. I was involved in a project in Bosnia-Herzegovina during the war in trying to teach tolerance to Bosnian kids. But it's a very difficult and slow thing to do, a very expensive thing to do. And if people are motivated to reject contrary information as they are through polarization, it becomes very difficult. Not to mention, by the way, very expensive. So as always, much more research on this needs to be done. We know way too little about how minorities view and evaluate American political institutions. We've scratched the surface on African Americans. I've been able to tell you practically nothing about 15% of our population, which is Hispanics. And as America becomes a more heterogeneous country, these cross-cultural differences, I think, are going to become critical to the success of American democracy. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to some discussion of these findings. And I think I'll quit sharing my screen if it doesn't take me 10 minutes to do so. And it doesn't.
There we go. Thanks, Jim. I see a number of people with their applause, either using the icon from Zoom or just doing this. And so it's, again, very interesting, articulate presentation. I suppose I have to say, well, I'd kind of like to talk to you about safaris. I'm really glad that we did talk about your research in this case. So a number of interesting questions in the chat already. Just to align expectations. So we're almost at 5 o'clock. Given that it's the end of the year, and I wanted to give the little overview of the Wiedenbaum Center and thank a few people at the beginning. We thought we would be willing to go a little beyond 5 in this conversation, so we can talk a little bit more with Jim. I want to just start the commentary, the questions out here a little bit. And Jim, you basically said this at the end of your talk, but I just want to give you my kind of interpretation in some sense. So you're finding some pretty important effects, differences across races, different perceptions of the legitimacy of American democracy, institutions, from the kinds of things you're looking at. But when you take a more laser focus on the events roughly between November and January of this, just recently around the election, before the election, with Amy Coney Barrett, and then through the Trump impeachment, you find in some sense a lack of effect as you said towards the end. This idea, it reinforces existing views, but doesn't really change them. And so what comes to my mind is both a good and a bad aspect of that. The good thing in some senses is it shows maybe a certain robustness. I think this was pretty disturbing. This was all over to say the least. Any one of the kinds of issues here, varied across different ideologies and things like that, but especially the events at the Capitol on January 6th, and a lot of the things around the election were dramatic and were highlighted in the press. But still, Americans didn't seem to be. It didn't change all that much. You didn't see big shifts at that point. So I take a certain kind of relief from that perspective. But on the other hand, it does suggest if those things are so deeply ingrained, and we do have problems, and we do have cross-racial differences in these perceptions that are a concern, that they're pretty solid, and as such, if you try to think about how we can go about changing them, just kind of saying, well, this was really bad, but we've gone beyond that. We've done some investigation, and things are okay. That's probably not going to be enough. So, am I characterizing at least one of the implications of your work correctly?
Yes, you are. Here's how I think about legitimacy. Legitimacy is not unlike interpersonal loyalty. So when you're loyal to another person, that other person may disappoint you from time to time, but generally speaking, those disappointments have to accumulate until the camel's back is broken by the straw, and then the loyalty dissipates and evaporates. We call this a reservoir of goodwill. I love that phrase, actually, a reservoir of goodwill. And what it means is that our institutions can fail in the short term, but only after repeated failure in the long term do we see the withdrawal of legitimacy. So I'm agreeing with you, Steve, 100%. These individual events are unlikely to have an immediate effect because of this reservoir of goodwill. But in the long term, if they develop, if they reinforce themselves over time with repeated failures, let's just say Germany 1936, if they reinforce with repeated failures, then the system can collapse. We have seen in the literature one instance of this. We published a paper a long time ago on Black attitudes toward the US Supreme Court. And what we showed is that Blacks, basically from the civil rights days, were very strongly supportive of the US Supreme Court, but with repeated decisions over time that were disappointments to Blacks, they withdrew support, and today they're much less supportive. So I'm agreeing with you. You know, public opinion never changes quickly on anything that's of any consequence. And so maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that means that the heat of the battle doesn't do undue damage. We have a theory, it's called the sober second thought. Maybe these are good for people to sit down and give a sober second thought about what they actually mean and whether they democratic institutions need to be abandoned. So I see both sides of it, but in my view, to mitigate these very substantial disruptions is probably a good thing, not a bad thing for the stability of democracy.
Very interesting. So we have a couple of several interesting questions in the chat window. I'll try to pull them together a little bit. In some sense, Steve Knight just joined the chat and talking about how one political party, unmentioned here, but I suppose the implication of the Republican Party is shaking faith in democratic institutions. And Elizabeth Larson mentions more specifically the recent responses, decisions from McCarthy and McConnell not to support an investigation of the insurrection. And actually, early on, Marty Einig was talking about, well, we're in a post-truth, period in some ways. How does this affect? And maybe that's a little hard to link in, but specifically, is it the case? Maybe one way of connecting some of these ideas, is there really a political motivation? Maybe he sees a political interest in the Republican Party in actually reducing our confidence in the election system, specifically as one institution. Maybe not so much the courts, but it's a difficult question. I don't know if I'm really asking a question, but maybe you can take some of my incoherent comments and make some sense out of it.
Well, I'm not sure I can, but I will rely on a book I wrote about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. And the conclusion of that book was that the investigations of the TRC, led by Mandela and Archbishop Tutu, the investigations did have a dramatic impact on the way white people understood apartheid in the history of their country. And that impact was to change attitudes. And what the TRC taught South Africans is that during the struggle, all sides did horrible things. Now, I think a commission that sets the record for not just the insurrection, but the whole set of events after the election would be very valuable to get a factual record that could possibly cause people to accept an outcome. The mess we have right now in Arizona is an example of how that process can fail, because the Arizona recount is going to do nothing to convince anyone, in my opinion. It took the leadership of someone like Mandela or someone like Tutu to get white people to accept. And I don't know how, I just don't know who that person would be and how that commission could function very well in the current climate in the US.
So let me ask a question that comes to mind that's a little more concrete along these lines. So you quoted a statistic and your own recent survey data is consistent with this, that 35 to 40% of Americans feel that the election was rigged in some sense, that the results of the election were illegitimate in this context. And that's in the current environment. Can you compare that to past elections, to other, has there been a shift as the result of the actions, the unusual actions around this past election?
I'm afraid I simply don't know the answer to that question. But let me speculate for a second. To my knowledge, pollsters have not asked that question about earlier elections. And perhaps one reason why they haven't is because there wasn't enough concern about those elections to make it interesting. I say that, and then I'll back off from that just in a second. You know, the election of 1960, the election of 1876, there are many American elections that were very highly contested. Bush versus Gore. I've written a lot about Bush versus Gore in the election of 2000. But I don't know is the short answer to your question, Steve.
Well, it is interesting. I was thinking about Bush versus Gore too. And it feels to me as if, so, you know, basically, I don't know, you would know the numbers much better than I, but we're talking about literally hundreds of votes in Florida on butterfly ballots and all kinds of things that could have shifted the outcome in this context. And well, for one thing, after somewhat protracted discussions and court rulings, but as I remember, maybe 3, at most 4 weeks, Al Gore concedes fairly graciously, and on we move. And it was basically over at that in that context. And it does seem, and you're right, if nobody was really asking the question, it seemed like, well, it really wouldn't come up. So that, I guess I would take that as somewhat unfavorable news about what's happened in this context, where at least some political interests seem to be aligned with keeping this alive. And then there's this, as Marty Heidegg points out, this post-truth context that we've moved to, not just about American democracy, but whether it was, you know, hydroxychloroquine or any number of other issues that have come up over these last years, which I personally, I should get off my soapbox here a little bit, but I personally find very disturbing as a social scientist who's dedicated 4 decades of research to try to figure out really how it works and find that evidence. So I pass that on to you once again.
You know, I'll be very brief on this. I've written quite a bit about Bush versus Gore. And the consequence of Bush versus Gore was to enhance the Supreme Court's legitimacy, to enhance it. And just about no one in the legal field believes that could possibly be the case. It was a 5-4 decision with 5 Republicans against 4 Democrats. It was a bitter decision, on and on and on. There are a million reasons why that decision should have had disastrous consequences for the institution. It did not. And part of the reason why you said Gore conceded 2 or 3 weeks later, that's not actually true. He conceded the next day after the decision. And I think that undermined the Democrats' ability to continue the fight. Now, there's an obvious contrast between the election of 2000 and the election of 2020, where the leadership of the losing party maybe today still has not conceded the election.
Yeah, and again, unfortunately, at least from my point of view, Gail Jackson just typed an interesting question at the chat that I'm trying to digest as we look at this. But I think broadly, what she has in mind is differences across educational level, and that, you know, would you broadly expect less motivated reasoning, or as she puts it, less confirmation bias in people who are more highly educated? And you know, I'd like to maybe believe that's true, but that's why we do the surveys. I don't know if you've cut your data this way, but what could we say to Gail about this?
So, Gail, we know a lot about this. It's called the elaboration likelihood model, and it's a curvilinear model. And let me explain to you what I mean by that. So, people with a very little information are very difficult to change because they don't pay attention. People with a whole lot of education are very difficult to change because they know the truth. They know that they're right. It turns out that it's the people, the sweet spot is the people who are educated enough to pay a little bit of attention, but don't have such strong beliefs that they override new information coming in from the environment. So it's a parabola like this. The high education are very difficult to change. The low education are very difficult to change. Those in the middle are the ones that are possible to change.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And again, once again, why we need to do the social science. That is, in fact, one of the things I somewhat responded to is when any politician or advocate of business, it's common sense. It's as if that's an adequate answer. We've had a lot of things that I think turn out not to be true that people think of as common sense, and that might be a good example.
Absolutely.
Maybe one last question here, especially about the racial differences, which are so central to your analysis in this recent research. So, do you think this spills over the perceptions of American democracy and American institutions held by African Americans? Do you think this spills over to voter participation?
Good question. I have a proposal pending at the Russell Sage Foundation that will, if funded, allow me to address some of those questions. But we know a couple of things. We know that probably the greatest mass mobilization that's ever happened in the history of this country has happened in the last year, with millions and millions of people mobilizing. Just an extraordinary level. And of course, a very large number of those are Black people. What we don't know, however, is what the consequences of mobilization are. So this alienation has created mobilization, but the mobilization could actually wind up feeding the alienation. We don't know that. A second thing we know is that support for political violence in this country has skyrocketed among everybody. Skyrocketed, because Steve, apropos your earlier question, we do have survey data on whether violence is worth it to preserve the system and things like that. And furthermore, Blacks are more willing to support political violence. They're more willing to support rioting. They're more willing even to support looting in the context of rioting. So the behavioral, I'm going a little bit beyond your question in answering it, but the behavioral consequences of this alienation from democracy could be more profound than the attitudinal consequences themselves. If people participate and they find the system is not responding, it's scary to think what might have happened in the country if the George Floyd verdict had been different than it was. The Derek Chaffin verdict had been different than it was. So the behavioral consequences, the consequences of this mobilization could exacerbate and further polarize more than anything else. I don't have data to support that speculation. Fingers are crossed that next year at this time I will.
Well, on the one hand, this is a little bit of a difficult place to wrap things up, because that is a rather kind of scary assessment, but speculation at this point, and the importance of actually doing the research. On the other hand, I think it does show the importance of this work. I think that this is a first order issue for the health of a society, of a democracy, as we go forward. And I think many of us are concerned about that in the context of the events of the past months. So with that, I very much appreciate, Jim, you sharing your work with us. I appreciate, again, those of us who remain, most of us on the call, your support for the Weidbaum Center. That allows us, scholars like Jim, to dig deeply into these issues. And we'll continue doing that. You'll continue hearing about it. As I mentioned at the beginning of our call today, that we are scheduling a rather kind of special event in the summer. I believe it's June 14th comes to my mind. I'm looking for Alana to shake her head yes, that's right, when we're going to have an interesting assessment with Steve Smith, Guillermo Rosas, and myself about the early part of the Biden administration, a little past the first 100 days, but with that kind of idea there. And so we welcome you to that. That'll be at our policy lunchtime around noon. And with that, I'm again want to thank Jim, want to thank the staff, want to thank everyone who stayed with us, and we'll look forward to seeing you in a few weeks, and especially next fall in who knows what mode we'll be in terms of our Weidenbaum Center events, but we will be here. That much I can guarantee you. So thanks very much, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.